I think that's putting it lightly.
Right. Our source material today isn't just a stack of documents. It's this sweeping, interdisciplinary exploration that really touches on the bedrock of human existence.
Hmm.
We're trying to synthesize molecular biology, the actual decay of the human organism,
Mm.
with radical 20th century philosophy on determinism.
And then, as if that's not enough, we're making a dizzying leap into hyperdimensional theories of time and consciousness.
It's a huge spread.
It is an incredible spread. I mean, you've got the most rigid, quantifiable science on one end, and on the other, the most liquid, boundary-breaking metaphysics.
But there is a thread that ties it all together, right?
Yes, there's a single powerful force uniting all these disparate threads for us today. And that's the universal concept of constraints. Limits. Our goal is to analyze precisely how the limits imposed on human experience, whether they're the physical constraints of our body, the philosophical constraints on our behavior, or, the societal limits on our knowledge, how they're formed and reinforced.
And crucially, we have to look at the other side of that coin, how that fundamental human drive for novelty, for imagination, tries to transcend those very constraints.
Exactly.
So we're asking you, the listener, how do these traditional grounded concepts of reality, the rules of physics and biology that dictate our lifespan, how do they interface with these more radical concepts like prophetic imagination, linguistic consciousness, and this potential for novelty to just completely reshape reality itself?
We are tracing a deep, persistent tension.
Well,
It's the tension between the inevitable decay of matter and the relentless pursuit of ultimate freedom.
and if we want to understand that tension, I guess we have to start with the most certain constraint of all.
The expiration date stamped on our biology.
Right. Let's start with aging. When we approach the science of it, we often just treat it as this universal prerequisite for life, something that simply must happen.
But the source material immediately challenges that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
It shows the shocking variability of the process across the tree of life.
It's not a given.
That assumption is fundamentally flawed. Aging is not this, conserved universal phenomenon. It's more like a biological program that operates on wildly different timescales.
Or in some cases, not at all.
Or not at all, exactly.
Uh.
I mean, consider a small mouse. It typically lives for, what, about 3 years?
Mm-hmm.
Now, compare that to a common squirrel. It's a creature of similar size, similar metabolism, but it can survive for up to 25 years.
That's a huge difference.
A massive difference. And it immediately suggests a programmed, species-specific difference, not just simple wear and tear.
And the variability just gets more extreme when we look at the outliers. We celebrate human longevity, right?
Yeah.
Figures like Jean Calment, who made it to 122.
Which is incredible.
It is, but we are absolutely dwarfed by certain other mammals.
Oh, completely. The bowhead whale is the reigning mammal champion. They've been documented to live for over 200 years.
200 years.
And then you have organisms that seem to have entirely cracked the code. The hydra, for example. It's a small freshwater organism.
Mm-hmm.
It appears to exhibit no discernible signs of senescence or aging whatsoever.
So it just doesn't get old.
It doesn't seem to. It suggests that it continue, but more like a switch that evolution has sometimes chosen to flip on or off, depending on, environmental pressures and reproductive strategies.
Okay, so if aging isn't inevitable, it must be something that can be accelerated by certain conditions. And this is where we move from evolutionary biology to experimental biology.
Right into the cosmic kidney study by Keith Sue.
Which takes us to the absolute extreme limit of human biological endurance, deep space.
This research zeroes in on the conditions you'd face on a long-duration space mission, like a trip to Mars. And it uses one specific organ as a kind of canary in the biological coal mine.
The kidney. The sources call it one of the most, if not the most, susceptible organ to stress in the body.
Yes.
But why the kidney specifically? What makes it such a high-risk barometer for decay?
Well, several factors compound its vulnerability, especially in deep space.
Mhm.
First, it's just an incredibly active filtration system. It's processing massive amounts of blood, which requires intense energy expenditure.
Okay.
Second, the deep space environment itself introduces these very unique stresses. You've got microgravity, which fundamentally alters fluid dynamics and blood pressure.
Putting word strain on it.
Exactly, abnormal strain on the glomeruli, the tiny filters. But the biggest factor, by far, is cosmic radiation. It's just so much more intense outside the protective bubble of Earth's magnetosphere.
And how does that radiation stress actually accelerate aging? Are we talking about like accumulated damage over time or some kind of swift systemic failure?
It's both, but the speed is the key finding here. The radiation and the microgravity, they induce this rapid, non-repairable cellular damage and inflammation.
It can't heal itself.
It can't keep up. The sources highlight that the kidney's necrosis mechanisms, the specific pathways that lead to cell death, are, and this is the term they use, highly resolved.
What does that mean, highly resolved?
It means they're very well understood and easily triggered under stress. It doesn't take much to push them over the edge. And this acute susceptibility allows researchers to witness an accelerated aging phenotype.
So the study basically turns a few years in space into decades of aging research.
Precisely. It's a biological fast-forward button.
You can just watch it happen in real time.
Exactly. By observing this specific accelerated breakdown of the kidney's function and structure, scientists can complete these decades-long aging trials in a fraction of the time. The problem is, the data reveals a chilling conclusion for human viability out there.
Which is that grim prognosis you mentioned, that a long-duration astronaut might need serious medical intervention before they even get to Mars.
The gravity of the study is really underscored by the explicit question the researchers pose. They ask, will an astronaut require dialysis or a transplant before they even get there?
Wow.
This isn't theoretical degradation. This is system collapse, accelerated by an environmental constraint. It forces us to confront the hard truth that our biological limits are extremely susceptible to these high-stress, novel environments.
It makes you think that mastering these decay mechanisms is, absolutely paramount if we ever want to become a multiplanetary species.
It's a non-negotiable first step.
And this research confirms that decay is complex, right? It's multifactorial, it's all interconnected, which seems to fly in the face of how biomedical research has traditionally been structured.
Absolutely. Historically, medicine has relied on the single disease, single drug model. You find a specific illness, you find the bug causing it, and you design a compound to kill it.
Simple cause and effect.
But aging doesn't work that way. When we talk about aging, we are really dealing with multimorbidity, the co-occurrence of multiple chronic diseases.
Things like heart disease and dementia.
Exactly. Cardiovascular disease, neurodegeneration, metabolic dysfunction. They are not isolated incidents. They are linked pathologies, all fueled by this common age-related systemic decline.
So the standard approach was just insufficient to capture this complexity, which led researchers to create these more comprehensive blueprints, like the hallmarks of aging.
Right. If you can't treat aging as one disease, you have to break down its component mechanisms. These hallmarks, there are typically 9 of them.
Things like genomic instability, telomere attrition. What's another one?
Loss of proteostasis, mitochondrial dysfunction. They provide a sort of conceptual map of the underlying molecular deficits. They're crucial for organizing research.
Yeah.
But they're descriptive, not explanatory.
Okay, what do you mean by that? Descriptive, but not explanatory.
They tell us what happens. We can see that mitochondria stop working efficiently, or we can see the genomes are becoming unstable. But they don't fully explain why that dysfunction arises as this coordinated systemic failure in the first place.
Or how all those microscopic problems cascade into the visible things we associate with aging.
Right. How do those tiny defects become wrinkling skin or reduce muscular strength? The map is there, but the territory is still pretty confusing.
And this is where the sources introduce a fascinating alternative framework, the idea of universal pathological pathways. The idea that if aging is a cascade, maybe we only need to target one main waterfall.
This is where good science makes a genuinely risky prediction. If there are universal, conserved pathological pathways that link these hallmarks, meaning a common node controls several outcomes, then targeting that single node could, in theory, alleviate multiple age-related diseases simultaneously.
Can you give us an example of this kind of pathway targeting?
Sure. The sources specifically mention the potential of pathways like GLP-1.
GLP-1.
Glucagon-like peptide 1. It's a naturally occurring hormone. It's best known for its role in regulating blood sugar and, promoting satiety in the digestive system.
Right. These are the drugs that have been making headlines recently for weight loss and diabetes.
Precisely. Yeah. But what's fascinating is that the pharmaceutical compounds that target these GLP-1 receptors have revealed benefits far beyond just treating type 2 diabetes or obesity.
What else are they seeing?
Well, they've shown significant potential benefits in areas like reducing the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events or degenerative diseases, and even treating certain liver conditions.
So it's not just one thing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It suggests GLP-1 is a conserved pathway, a central regulatory point that influences not just metabolism, but the overall inflammatory and stress response of the body.
So the risky prediction is that if you can modulate this one pathway, You might delay or treat a huge swath of diseases that used to require all these different specialized drugs.
It is a profound shift. You're moving from the single disease, single drug model to a single pathway, multiple conditions approach.
What's the catch?
The caveat, as always, is that you are affecting a genetic program that evolution selected for a reason. We are manipulating deep systemic programming and the long-term systemic consequences of that. Well, that remains, by necessity, part of the unfolding clinical trial.
It really makes you wonder, if a simple chemical pathway can influence such a vast cascade of aging outcomes, then the body's time limit.
Yeah.
It's not a solid wall. Maybe it's more like a highly permeable membrane.
The more we understand the system's flux, its ability to change and adapt, the less defined that biological constraint appears to be.
And that concept of inevitability, that now moves us from the biological body to the philosophical mind. If our bodies are determined by decay, are our actions determined by our environment and our conditioning?
This brings us directly to the radical and I'd say uncompromising determinism of B.F. Skinner.
Skinner's behaviorism is just a direct attack on the whole notion of autonomy and free will.
Oh, full frontal assault. He argued that the traditional human struggle for freedom isn't rooted in some, spiritual or philosophical ideal. Instead, it's a modification of our genetic endowment. We are genetically programmed to free ourselves from aversive, coercive, or punitive conditions.
Why?
Because that resistance mechanism contributes to our survival.
So, when we resist a tyrant or challenge a punitive system, we're not making some grand philosophical choice about liberty.
No, you're simply exhibiting a highly refined, conditioned survival response against pain.
And if you trace that back, Skinner says the only true value by which behavior is judged is survival.
And crucially, he says we do not choose survival as a value. It chooses us. It originates entirely in evolutionary theory and selective action, a culture that develops adaptive practices, practices that meet the current environmental contingencies and resolve conflict. That's simply the culture that's more likely to endure.
This brings us to a core question from one of our listeners. How do you then interpret the works of Dr. Skinner and this idea of free will? Because if you accept the premises of that, then nobody's in control, as they say.
From the perspective of the behavior analyst, yes, that's correct. The concept of an undetermined free will operating outside of established contingencies is, well, it's obsolete.
But Skinner's focus wasn't on philosophical despair, was it? It was more on engineering a better society.
Exactly. His work focused on control, specifically through his detailed analysis of what he called schedules of reinforcement.
We hear that term schedules of reinforcement a lot, but what does it actually entail? How is it used as this precise tool of control?
A schedule of reinforcement is essentially just a rule. It's a rule that determines how and when the consequences of a behavior are contingent upon an organism's action. It's the engine of behavioral engineering. And the difference between schedules is critical.
Okay, can you break down the main types for us?
Certainly. So you have continuous reinforcement, where every single response gets reinforced.
Yeah.
That leads to very fast learning, but also very fast extinction. The behavior stops quickly when the reward stops.
Right.
But then you move into intermittent schedules, which are far more powerful for maintaining behavior. You have fixed ratio, or FR, where reinforcement occurs after a specific fixed number of responses. Think of piecework pay in a factory.
So you get a burst of activity and then a little pause after the reward.
A burst of activity followed by a pause.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you have the variable ones, which, as you said, sound a bit more insidious.
Yeah, they do.
And they are far more resistant to extinction. A variable ratio, or VR, schedule reinforces behavior after an unpredictable number of responses.
Slot machines.
The perfect example is a slot machine, or checking your social media feed. The variability generates these high, steady rates of responding because the next reward could come at any moment.
That's why it's so invictive.
Then you have interval schedules, which are based on time. Fixed interval, or FI, reinforces the first response after a fixed amount of time has passed. This leads to a scallop-shaped pattern of behavior. The response rate increases as you get closer to the deadline.
Like studying for an exam right before it happens.
Exactly. And finally, you have variable interval 6, which reinforces the first response after an unpredictable amount of time has passed. This leads to a steady, moderate rate of responding. Think of checking your email. This kind of nuanced control, Skinner argued, could revolutionize complex social systems.
And he had some bold claims. You mentioned he believed this could completely revolutionize the school system in Chicago within 1 year. How would applying these schedules even achieve that?
It means fundamentally changing the contingencies. So instead of relying on punitive, aversive controls, like forcing children to sit quietly or punishing them for getting an answer wrong, you arrange positive reasons for engaging in the desired behavior.
You make learning itself rewarding.
You make the act of learning reinforcing, maybe through variable ratio schedules that provide unexpected bursts of recognition or access to preferred activities, all contingent on efficient study. The goal is that children come gladly and study efficiently because the environment has been engineered to make that the most rewarding path, rather than them dragging their heels out of fear.
And he applied this same logic to really complex environments, like prisons. He talked about places like Attica.
He did. Skinner saw the utter boredom as completely counterproductive, a total failure of design.
So what was his solution?
He argued that if you applied operant conditioning principles, you could design prison systems that give prisoners positive reasons for behaving well and acquiring skills, rather than just forcing compliance through fear. They would, in theory, choose to acquire skills that would help them integrate into society upon release.
Which leads to actual rehabilitation, not just storage.
Right. He viewed riots and rebellions, like the one at Attica, as clear signals of the failure of purely coercive and punitive systems to sustain any long-term behavioral change.
The idea that we can be perfectly engineered for optimal survival is, well, it's a powerful vision, but it has to face a profound philosophical hurdle, which is articulated by critics who push back against this pure mechanistic analysis.
The primary critique really revolves around a crucial logical distinction: the confusion between the spectator's analysis and the actor's analysis.
Okay, what's the difference?
The scientist, the spectator, looking at the brain and all the external contingencies from the outside. They may be able to mechanistically trace every cause and effect and determine the outcome with scientific certainty.
But the actor is living in the moment.
Correct. The actor, the person experiencing the moment of choice, correctly views the outcome as yet undetermined. You can't deny the mechanistic explicability of the underlying causes, but that knowledge doesn't negate the subjective, experiential reality of choice and uncertainty in the moment of action.
So the actor's correct perception is always that the future is open.
That's a powerful point. Even if the physics dictates the final outcome, the process of living through that uncertain moment is the experience of freedom.
I see.
And furthermore, critics argue that these purely deterministic punitive systems ultimately fail because they violate our fundamental genetic endowment, that inherent tendency to resist and attack coercion.
So when systems rely only on aversive control,
like totalitarian regimes or harsh prison environments, they create conditions that we are biologically programmed to oppose and attack.
and what's the end result of that opposition?
Ultimately, self-destruction or failure to marshal allies. I mean, for a time, systems like Nazi Germany appear successful through intense punitive methods, but a culture that relies exclusively on fear and coercion generates opposition both internally and externally. It eventually leads to failure.
So the systems that actually endure are the ones that...
The ones that inspire, that reinforce, that provide positive reasons for participation. They respect that innate drive for survival without relying solely on painful constraints.
So we've covered the biological limit of decay and the philosophical constraint of determinism. Now, let's scale up to the level of society and address the constraint placed on our collective reality, our worldview, through the control and manipulation of information.
Control over knowledge is perhaps the oldest mechanism of power. Authorities, both secular and religious, have consistently used it to suppress dissenting or heretical views that threaten the prevailing order. And the most symbolic, most violent expression of this constraint is biblioclasm.
The act of book burning.
The act of book burning.
And the history of book burning is really a history of constraint. We see it with the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, trying to destroy records of the past to unify thought around his rule.
We see it with the Nazis, methodically torching libraries of works they deemed un-German.
And even during the Cold War, right? The American Red Scare led to the targeting and sometimes burning of American literature in overseas U.S. libraries because of a perceived political threat.
And today, the tactic is less about physical bonfires and more about achieving the same result, censorship and self-censorship, through sophisticated administrative and legislative coercion.
The sources give some very clear modern examples in the U.S., like the actions taken by Texas legislator Matt Krause.
He was called the one-man book police.
So what was the mechanism he used? How did that work?
Krause sent a letter to every public school in Texas. He demanded to know if they shelved any of the books on his detailed list of 850 titles.
And the list was?
It was heavily focused on themes of diversity, gender identity, and materials from diverse authors. It wasn't generated by local parents or librarians. The sheer bureaucratic burden and the threat of political challenge led to widespread fear and compliance.
Then this leads directly to a listener's question. It makes you wonder, why would any parent ban a book? I mean, unless they just didn't know how to explain it to their child, right?
And that sounds more like a parenting issue than a school issue, don't you think?
Well, the current wave of campaigns suggests it's not always an organic local parent action. The sources detail how these campaigns are often carbon copies, organized by Republican operatives and highly focused on broad ideological pushes.
Like labeling certain books as pornography or banning concepts like critical race theory.
Right. It's done to generate outrage and mobilize a political base. It's a conflict rooted in worldview constraint. So it's often a campaign against ideas or authors, rather than a focused critique of specific literary content.
And the administrative constraints imposed by these campaigns, they lead to profound institutional destabilization, like what we saw in Idaho with that financial bounty system.
Right, let's explain that bounty system because it's pretty extreme.
What does that law mandate?
The new Idaho law requires public libraries to establish special adult-only sections for certain categories of books materials deemed sensitive for minors. If the library fails to comply and a patron complains, the library has to pay $250 directly to the complainer. To the individual.
Yes, it creates a financial incentive, a bounty to find non-compliance.
That sounds like an existential threat, especially for a small rural library.
It is. I mean, consider the library in Donnelly, Idaho. They operate in a space of only about 1,000 square feet. They just don't have the physical capacity or the staff or the resources to build and enforce a separate, secure adult section within the 60-day time frame the law gives them.
So what did they do?
Their solution was drastic. They declared themselves an adults-only library, effectively excluding all children, who were traditionally the largest users of public library services.
That's a complete destabilization of the institution.
Driven entirely by fear and legislative constraint. And of course, the most subtle constraint of all is self-censorship.
Right. The threat alone is enough to work.
Absolutely. Before any law was even passed, one school district in San Antonio, Texas, preemptively ordered the removal of 400 books from their shelves. They did it to protect their funding and resources from the guaranteed onslaught of challenges spurred by the political climate. The ultimate constraint is achieved not by burning, but by fear and administrative compliance.
And that control over our collective reality, it shifts seamlessly from physical books to the digital information sphere, where governments exert constraint through mass surveillance.
Yes, and when the NSA was first developing its mass data collection programs worldwide, including those that inevitably swept up data on U.S. citizens, there were these really serious internal consequences.
How was the mass collection of U.S. citizen data proposed to be legally tenable? How did they try to justify it?
There was a proposal put forth to make the surveillance constitutionally acceptable by encrypting all the personally identifiable attributes of U.S. citizens, things like names, addresses, geographic locations.
So the analysts couldn't tell who the data belonged to.
Exactly. The idea was to maintain the massive collection capability while anonymizing the U.S. person information.
And did that encryption solve the constitutional problem?
Well, the expert who proposed it noted that they never received a clear legal sign-off. The core constitutional legality of collecting the data at all remains deeply contentious. Furthermore, the constraint isn't just imposed by big brother federal agencies, it's also imposed by what we call the little brother effect.
Ah, the local granular spread of surveillance technology.
Precisely. This is often centralized through what are called fusion centers. These are intelligence sharing hubs, ostensibly designed to prevent terrorism, where federal, state, and local law enforcement pool resources, technology, and data.
And the sources highlight how this trickle-down effect leads to the constraint of local political dissent.
Yes. The example given is the Boston Police Department.
What did they do?
The Boston Police, operating through these fusion centers, were found to be tracking peace protesters and labeling them as extremist criminal threats in their databases.
So you have innocent people engaging in constitutionally protected protest.
Being swept into intelligence files and monitored. These systems often operate in secrecy, and they focus on controlling dissent and maintaining the local status quo, thereby constraining the self-perception of politically active citizens.
And finally, when we're discussing governmental constraint on public reality, we have to adhere very strictly to the sources regarding the recent release of sensitive data concerning Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes, maintaining strict impartiality is absolutely critical here.
So what we're doing is simply reporting on the content provided.
Exactly. The source material reports on private emails sent or received by Jeffrey Epstein over a 15-year period. These were released into the public domain by the House Oversight Committee after they issued a bipartisan subpoena to Epstein's estate. And these emails mentioned Donald Trump multiple times.
Okay, so what are the source details within those emails? Again, keeping in mind the need for absolute context, clarity, and neutrality.
In one email, dated March 2009, sent from Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein referenced Trump allegedly knowing about the girls and asking Maxwell to stop. This is a direct statement within the email, and its context and veracity are not confirmed by the committee itself.
Okay.
Separately, in a different email in 2017 to the journalist Michael Wolff, Epstein denied ever having been a member of Mar-a-Lago, despite Trump's public assertion that he had asked Epstein to resign from the club.
And there was another reference.
The sources also noted the committee released an email referencing an alleged victim who spent hours at Epstein's house with Trump, though the victim's name was redacted to protect survivors.
And what must we emphasize about the limitations of this information?
We have to underscore that the sources provide these emails lacking full surrounding context, and they confirm that Donald Trump did not send or receive any of those specific quoted messages.
So the relevance to our deep dive today is simply,
It's that this is sensitive data, unearthed through official government channels, that now profoundly influences and constrains the public narrative and the perceived reality surrounding powerful figures. Both the suppression of information and the controlled release of sensitive information are fundamental constraints on our public worldview.
okay, we have meticulously mapped the boundaries. We've got the biological clock, the philosophical cage of determinism, and the political control of information. Now, the final pivot. What happens when the human spirit actively pursues the complete opposite of constraint?
When we chase absolute novelty and unconstrained imagination,
Exactly.
this is where we enter the realm of the visionary who actively rejected the boundaries imposed by... And our key figure here is the 18th century poet William Blake.
Blake viewed the prevailing intellectual and industrial forces of his time, the Enlightenment's cold rationalism and the start of the Industrial Revolution, as a form of spiritual oppression. He symbolized this constraint as the satanic mill.
The satanic mill is Blake's symbol for rigid, abstract logic, form, and philosophy. It represents the mechanized, repetitive system that reduces the infinite, vibrant world into sterile, quantifiable parts. His character, Urizen, is the embodiment of this force, the reasoner, the architect of abstract laws.
So Urizen's starry intellectual wheels create a world that keeps humanity in a deep, constrained slumber of death.
That's his worldview.
Yeah.
And Blake's alternative to this mill.
The imagination.
Imagination. Blake considered imagination to be the divine itself. He called it the divine body of the Lord Jesus. For Blake, true reality is not found in the abstract laws of science or morality, but in the specific, sensory, and transformative act of creation and perception.
And he believed that language and perception held this profound, immediate, transformative power.
Absolutely. His famous quote, "Truth can never be told so as to be understood and not to be believed," it underscores the idea that if a concept can be perfectly articulated, its truth is immediately self-evident and compelling. You don't need rational proof if the imaginative insight is sufficiently clear.
So how does he advise one escape the confines of Urizen's law?
Through radical action and a rejection of the past, he urged his contemporaries to drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead.
Which means rejecting the old traditions, the conventional morality.
The constraining laws of the fathers. For Blake, logic and conventional morality are the true constraints. True creation and true vision come from impulse, from excess, from the absolute pursuit of unconstrained experience.
This brings us back to that earlier philosophical inquiry from a listener. If we are driven to explore wild ideology to shatter our limited worldview, Blake would see this as a moral and necessary action.
He would see it as the only path to spiritual awakening. Constraint leads to decay and death. Imaginative novelty leads to life and divinity.
So if Blake used poetry to break logic, Terence McKenna and his brother Dennis used chemistry and mathematics to try and shatter physics itself.
Yes, and this came out of their extensive exploration of non-traditional concepts of reality, often facilitated by psychedelic compounds.
Their experiences convinced them that consciousness wasn't just a passive recipient of external reality,
but that it could induce profound, even systemic changes in the temporal dimension. And this led to the rigorous development of what they called novelty theory.
How did they formalize this theory? I mean, it sounds highly abstract.
They attempted to mathematically formalize the variable and cyclical nature of novelty's ingression into the world. And crucially, they did this using the structure of the ancient Chinese text, the I Ching, or the Book of Changes.
The I Ching. Why that specifically?
Well, the I Ching is based on 64 hexagrams, which are binary structures. McKenna interpreted these 64 hexagrams as mapping the nested cycles of time. By analyzing the structural complexity and sequence of these hexagrams, they generated a mathematical wave, the time wave zero graph.
And what did that graph claim to show?
They claimed it charted the rate at which novelty or complexity accelerates through history. And this novelty accelerates toward a singularity.
A definitive endpoint.
Yes. The theory posits an ultimate transition, an eschatological event or a transition of regime that transforms the very modalities of reality completely.
And how did they apply this to things like unexplained phenomena?
They interpreted the UFO phenomenon, for example, not as traditional extraterrestrial craft, but as a hyperdimensional artifact.
So a temporal shockwave generated by the future singularity.
Precisely. They saw it as an ingression of a higher dimensional epoch, which reverberates through history. A feedback loop where the future is actively impacting the present because novelty is accelerating to infinity.
And this leads to their most radical concepts about the relationship between thought, language, and matter. The theory of translinguistic matter.
This is a really deep dive into chemistry and metaphysics. The McKenna brothers theorized that consciousness can literally work changes in the temporal dimension and matter is permeable.
How so?
Specifically, they hypothesized that a precise vocal sound, a frequency, or a vibrational pattern could interact with and affect tryptamines in the brain.
And what would that interaction create?
It could create hyperdimensional superconducting matter, or translinguistic matter. The conceptual leap is that this molecule literally carries its trip on the outside of itself.
I'm not sure I follow.
It's a structure that embodies information. It functions as a mind or a thought process that is physically present. It's a piece of consciousness you can literally hold in your hand.
So language and sound are not just descriptive tools, they are formative tools for reality.
And this leads to the ultimate implication for reality constraint. They speculated that the psychedelic experience is not contact with an outside alien intelligence,
But a return to rapport with the bicameral mind.
yes, a concept popularized by Julian Jaynes. It represents an older, non-personal, transpersonal part of the psyche.
And how is this mind different?
It is a mind that they claim is not distinct from matter and is capable of literally doing anything. If this internal, non-local consciousness can affect temporal dimensions and shape matter through language, then the perceived hard limits of physics and biology, including the aging process, are themselves just artifacts of a constrained consensus reality.
That is a staggering implication. It suggests that decay and aging are less a fixed physical law and more a lack of novelty, a lack of imaginative input enforced by a limited worldview.
If the constraints of scientific laws are just slowly evolving flux phenomena dependent on the time in which they are tested, then our lifespan might be fundamentally malleable, waiting only for a sufficient shift in human consciousness to transform entirely.
We have completed a massive journey today. We've traveled from the highly constrained, accelerated biological decay modeled by the human kidney in deep space,
Through the limits of behavioral determinism imposed by Skinner.
across the political boundaries of information control, and finally into these radical philosophies that suggest reality itself is permeable and fundamentally dependent on consciousness and language.
And as we synthesize all of this, we have to return to a critical grounding principle that understanding real-world systems requires rigorous, unbiased data collection, not broad assumptions. The constraints we perceive are often shaped by our data methodologies.
This brings us back to the sociological analysis provided by Thomas Sowell regarding economic disparity, which really illustrates the danger of generalization.
Sowell's work emphasized the need for careful categorization to avoid misleading conclusions. He conducted an analysis looking specifically at college-educated Black families, where both the husband and wife had degrees.
Okay.
When looking at this meticulously defined category, their income not only matched, but in some cases, surpassed that of their white counterparts in the same category.
So the aggregate figures, which show a persistent racial income gap, they told one story. But when you constrain the variables to compare like for like, the story changed dramatically.
Exactly. The issue was not simple institutional discrimination at the employer level for this specific, highly educated group. Rather, the aggregate data reflected broader societal structural constraints.
Like the historically smaller proportion of the Black population that had access to and completed higher education.
And the cumulative effects of poor earlier schooling on older generations, for example. The generalized conclusion about income disparity was correct, but the generalized cause, simple institutional racism, was too simplistic when analyzing specific subgroups.
So generalization, the quick linguistic constraint we put on a complex reality, it shapes our belief, even when nuanced data suggests reality is far more category dependent.
That principle is the ultimate takeaway for our deep dive today. Whether we are discussing the alleged hard biological limit of our lifespan, a philosophical boundary on free will, or a political restriction on information, the value of knowledge lies in recognizing the boundary of the actual constraint, as opposed to the perceived or generalized constraint. The freedom is in defining the line correctly.
The ultimate freedom, then, isn't the ability to do whatever we want. It's the recognition that the constraint exists only where we allow it to exist, either through our biology, our behavior, or our limited perception.
And that leads to our final provocative thought, drawing together Blake's transcendentalism and McKenna's novelty physics. Blake wrote, "What seems to be is to those to whom it seems to be." If we take this subjective perception and we couple it with the McKenna-derived idea that scientific laws themselves are not fixed universal constants, but slowly evolving flux phenomena dependent on the time in which they are tested, we have to seriously ask, is our lifespan, this hard biological limit of aging and decay, fundamentally constrained by a consensus reality? A limited imaginative paradigm that, once shifted or understood through the lens of profound, accelerating novelty, can be transformed entirely.
So if the universe is a process of constant change, and we are capable of engineering novelty, perhaps aging is simply the failure to reimagine ourselves, biologically and psychologically.